Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Foundation Cracks. Anthony Huffman stood in his mahogany-paneled office, staring out at the Seattle skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. At 42, he commanded respect in the city's elite circles, a self-made millionaire who'd built his security consulting firm from nothing. His reputation was built on one simple principle: loyalty was everything, and betrayal was unforgivable. The irony wasn't lost on him that the woman who'd shared his bed for 15 years was about to shatter that very foundation. Margaret Huffman sat across from divorce attorney Phyllis Solis, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the conference table. At 38, Margaret had transformed from the struggling art student Anthony had married into a polished society wife. But beneath that facade lurked ambitions that had grown too large for their marriage to contain. "Mrs. Huffman," Phyllis said, sliding documents across the table, "your husband's financial portfolio is substantial. We're talking about a $50 million empire." Margaret's green eyes gleamed. "And my children? Full custody is challenging, but not impossible. Your husband has no criminal record, no history of abuse. What if there were concerns about his mental stability?" Margaret interrupted. Phyllis raised an eyebrow. "That would require professional evaluation and documentation." Margaret smiled, thinking of her boyfriend, Carlos Waters. A decorated police sergeant with 15 years on the force, Carlos had connections that could prove invaluable. More importantly, he'd do anything for her, a weakness she intended to exploit fully. That evening, Anthony returned to their Bellevue mansion to find Margaret arranging flowers in the foyer. Their children, Jeremy, 16, and Laura, 14, were upstairs doing homework. The picture of domestic tranquility, a facade that had been crumbling for months. "How was your day?" Margaret asked without looking up. "Profitable," Anthony replied, studying his wife's profile. He'd built his fortune reading people, identifying threats before they materialized. Every instinct screamed that Margaret was planning something, but he'd underestimated how far she'd already progressed. "Anthony, we need to talk about us," Margaret said, finally meeting his gaze. "I'm listening. I want a divorce." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Anthony's expression didn't change, but Margaret caught the subtle shift in his posture, the way his shoulders squared, his hands stilled. She'd just declared war on a man who'd never lost a battle. "I see," Anthony said quietly. "And the children? They'll be better off with me. You're always traveling, always working. They need stability." Anthony nodded slowly, his mind already calculating possibilities. "I assume you've given this considerable thought. More than you know." As Margaret walked away, Anthony pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "Franklin? It's Anthony Huffman. I need a call on that favor." Franklin Gilmore had been Anthony's military intelligence partner in Afghanistan, now running a private investigation firm. If Margaret thought she could outmaneuver someone who'd hunted terrorists in Kandahar, she was about to learn otherwise. Chapter 2. The Enemy Within. 2 weeks later, Anthony sat in Franklin's downtown office, reviewing surveillance footage on multiple monitors. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. "She's been meeting with Carlos Waters for 3 months, Franklin reported, his weathered face grim. Seattle PD sergeant, divorced last year, known for bending rules when it suits him. The footage showed Margaret and Carlos in intimate embraces at various hotels around the city. But it was the final clip that truly unveiled the scope of their betrayal. "This was recorded yesterday at Waters' apartment," Franklin continued, enhancing the audio. Margaret's voice crackled through the speakers. "The psychological evaluation is next week. Dr. Nina Slaughter owes Carlos a favor. Something about evidence disappearing from a domestic violence case. She'll write whatever we need." Carlos's voice followed. "What exactly are we documenting?" "Paranoid personality disorder, potential for violence, history of controlling behavior. Enough to convince Judge Haley that the children aren't safe." Anthony's hands clenched into fists. Dr. Nina Slaughter was a respected child psychologist who'd built her career on protecting vulnerable children. The idea that she'd fabricate evidence to destroy a family was sickening, but not surprising. Everyone had secrets, and Carlos had obviously found hers. "There's more," Franklin said, switching to another monitor. "Judge Glenn Haley has been gambling heavily at the Tulip Casino. He's deep in debt to some very unpleasant people. Waters has been providing protection in exchange for favorable rulings." The picture was becoming clear. Margaret hadn't just found herself a lover. She'd found herself a criminal conspiracy. They were planning to steal his children using forged documents and a corrupted judicial system. Anthony stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. In Afghanistan, he learned that sometimes good men had to do terrible things to protect what mattered most. Margaret had chosen her battlefield. Now she discovered what happened when you declared war on someone who'd perfected the art of destruction. "Franklin, I need you to dig deeper. Find everything. Waters' service record, Slaughter's patient files, Haley's gambling debts. I want to know every secret, every weakness, every pressure point." And then Anthony turned back to his old friend, his eyes holding the cold fury that had once terrified insurgents in a war zone. "Then we teach them what real paranoia looks like." That night, Anthony returned home to find Jeremy shooting basketball hoops in the driveway. His son had inherited his mother's artistic features, but Anthony's sharp intelligence. At 16, Jeremy was already showing signs of the strategic thinking that had made Anthony successful. "Dad, can we talk?" Jeremy asked, palming the basketball. They sat on the porch steps, the Seattle evening air crisp with approaching autumn. Anthony studied his son's face, noting the tension around his eyes. "What's on your mind?" "It's Mom," Jeremy said carefully. "She's been different lately. Secretive. And there's this cop who keeps calling." Anthony felt a surge of protective rage. Margaret's betrayal was devastating enough, but involving their children in her deception crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. "What kind of different?" "She's been asking weird questions about you, about your temper, about whether you've ever scared us. And yesterday, I overheard her on the phone talking about some doctor's appointment that we're all supposed to go to." The psychological evaluation. Margaret was already poisoning their children's minds, preparing them to testify against their own father. "Jeremy, I want you to listen carefully," Anthony said, his voice steady despite the fury building inside him. "Your mother and I are having problems. But whatever happens, remember that I love you and Laura more than my own life. Nothing will ever change that." Jeremy nodded, but Anthony could see the confusion and fear in his son's eyes. Margaret wasn't just destroying their marriage. She was traumatizing their children in the process. As Anthony tucked Laura into bed later that evening, she asked, "Daddy, are you and Mommy getting divorced?" The innocent question hit him like a physical blow. Laura had always been the sensitive one, the peacemaker who tried to fix everything with hugs and hand-drawn pictures. "We're working through some difficulties, sweetheart," Anthony said, smoothing her hair. "But no matter what happens, you'll always be my little girl." Laura hugged him tightly. "I don't want you to go away." "I'm not going anywhere," Anthony promised, though he knew Margaret was planning to ensure exactly that. After the children were asleep, Anthony found Margaret in her study, typing on her laptop. She closed it quickly when he entered. "Planning something?" he asked casually. "Just correspondence," she replied, but her voice carried a defensive edge. Anthony nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Margaret, you should know that I've never made idle threats in my life. But if you try to take my children from me, you'll discover exactly how dangerous a desperate father can become." The threat hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Margaret's confident facade wavered. She'd married Anthony when he was building his empire, but she'd never seen the darker skills that had made his success possible. "Is that a threat, Anthony?" "It's a promise," he said quietly, and walked away. That night, as Margaret lay beside him pretending to sleep, Anthony stared at the ceiling and began planning his war. Margaret thought she was playing chess, but she was about to discover she'd brought checkers to a match against a grandmaster. Chapter 3. The Gathering Storm. The family meeting with Dr. Nina Slaughter took place in her sterile downtown office, all white walls and abstract art designed to appear non-threatening. Margaret sat beside Carlos, who'd been introduced as a family friend, while Anthony observed from across the room with Jeremy and Laura flanking him. Dr. Slaughter was a thin woman in her 50s with graying hair and calculating eyes. Anthony watched her carefully, noting how she avoided direct eye contact with him while showering attention on Margaret and the children. "This is just an informal assessment," Dr. Slaughter explained, though Anthony noticed the recording equipment on her desk. "I want to understand the family dynamics and ensure everyone's emotional well-being during this difficult transition." For the next hour, she asked seemingly innocuous questions that Anthony recognized as carefully crafted traps. Every query about his work schedule, his temper, his relationship with the children was designed to build a narrative of an absent, potentially dangerous father. Margaret played her part perfectly, mentioning Anthony's unpredictable moods and his obsession with control. Carlos nodded sympathetically, occasionally adding observations about how law enforcement recognized the warning signs of domestic instability. But Anthony had spent 15 years reading hostile interrogators, and Dr. Slaughter's technique was amateur by comparison. More importantly, he noticed something she didn't expect him to see: a small, encrypted recording device taped beneath her desk, obviously placed there by Carlos to capture conversations for later manipulation. When the session ended, Dr. Slaughter promised her report would be ready for the custody hearing next week. As they left the building, Anthony watched Carlos whisper something in Margaret's ear that made her smile. That evening, Anthony received an encrypted message from Franklin. "Package delivered. Check your secure email." The intelligence file Franklin had compiled was devastating. Dr. Slaughter had been taking bribes for favorable evaluations for 3 years, funded by various law enforcement officers who needed problematic cases to disappear. Carlos wasn't just a dirty cop. He was running a systematic corruption scheme that extended throughout the King County family court system. Judge Glenn Haley owed over $200,000 to casino loan sharks, money he'd borrowed to fund a gambling addiction that had destroyed his previous marriage. Carlos had been making his payments in exchange for predetermined rulings in custody cases. But the most shocking revelation was personal. Carlos Waters was Laura's biological father. Anthony stared at the DNA analysis Franklin had obtained from hair samples. The affair had been going on for over 14 years, meaning Margaret had been lying about Laura's parentage since her birth. The betrayal cut deeper than Anthony had thought possible. A knock on his study door interrupted his thoughts. Jeremy entered, looking unusually serious for a 16-year-old. "Dad, I need to tell you something about today." Anthony closed the laptop and gave his son full attention. "What is it?" "That doctor," she was asking weird questions. "And when you left to use the bathroom, she told me and Laura that sometimes fathers can become dangerous when families break apart. She wanted to know if you'd ever hurt us or made us feel unsafe." The manipulation was even more insidious than Anthony had realized. Dr. Slaughter wasn't just planning to fabricate evidence. She was grooming his children to provide it. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you've never hurt us. Never even raised your voice." "But Dad," Jeremy hesitated. "I don't think she wanted to hear that." Anthony felt a surge of pride mixed with protective fury. His son was demonstrating the same analytical intelligence that had served Anthony well in business and war. "Jeremy, I need you to understand something. There are people who want to separate our family, and they're willing to lie to do it. Your mother believes she's doing what's best, but she's being manipulated by someone very dangerous." "The cop." "Yes. Carlos Waters is not the man he pretends to be." Jeremy absorbed this information with mature consideration. "What can we do?" The question hung between them like a bridge spanning generations. Anthony had sworn to protect his children from the darker aspects of his nature, but circumstances were forcing a choice between their innocence and their safety. "I need you to trust me and do exactly what I say when I say it." "Can you do that?" Jeremy nodded solemnly. "What about Laura?" Anthony looked toward his daughter's room, where she was probably drawing pictures or reading one of her fantasy novels, blissfully unaware that her entire world was about to collapse. "Laura doesn't need to know everything yet. But Jeremy, you're old enough to understand that sometimes good people have to make hard choices to protect the people they love." Like in Afghanistan, Anthony had never discussed his military service in detail, but Jeremy was perceptive enough to understand that his father's skills extended beyond business consulting. Exactly like Afghanistan. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Anthony sat in his study and made a series of encrypted phone calls. By morning, he'd assembled a team of specialists from his military days, men who understood that sometimes justice required working outside the system. Spencer Stewart, his former demolitions expert, now ran a private security firm in Tacoma. Doug Bowers, his old intelligence analyst, worked as a forensic accountant specializing in financial crimes. Morris Carpenter, their former medic, had become a highly skilled investigator with a talent for extracting information from reluctant sources. Each man owed Anthony their life from various missions in Afghanistan. More importantly, each understood that some betrayals demanded consequences that went far beyond legal remedies. The custody hearing was scheduled for Friday morning. Margaret, Carlos, and Dr. Slaughter believed they held all the cards: a corrupt judge, fabricated evidence, and a system designed to favor mothers in custody disputes. They were about to discover that Anthony Huffman played by different rules entirely. As he finalized his plans, Anthony reflected on the man he'd once been, someone who believed in justice, honor, and the fundamental goodness of people. Margaret's betrayal had killed that man, leaving something far more dangerous in his place. She'd wanted a divorce, and she'd get one. But she'd also learned that stealing a man's children carried a price that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The war was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Art of War. Friday morning arrived with Seattle's typical October drizzle. The courtroom at King County Superior Court filled with the usual collection of broken families seeking judicial resolution. Anthony entered wearing his best charcoal suit, projecting the calm confidence of a man who'd spent years in hostile environments. Margaret sat with her attorney Phyllis Solis at the plaintiff's table, Carlos Waters conspicuously absent, but undoubtedly monitoring the proceedings from outside. Dr. Slaughter occupied a seat in the gallery, her fabricated psychological evaluation tucked neatly in her briefcase. Judge Glenn Haley took the bench precisely at 9 a.m., his bloodshot eyes and nervous demeanor betraying the pressure he was under. Anthony noted the subtle tremor in the judge's hands. A man being crushed by debts he couldn't pay and choices he couldn't undo. "Your Honor," Phyllis Solis began, "we're here because of serious concerns about Mr. Huffman's fitness as a parent. Dr. Slaughter's psychological evaluation has identified several troubling patterns." Dr. Slaughter was called to testify, her professional demeanor masking the corruption beneath. She spoke eloquently about Anthony's controlling behavior, his potential for violence, and his inability to provide emotional stability for the children. The fabricated report painted Anthony as a dangerous father whose business success masked deep psychological problems. Every carefully chosen phrase was designed to justify awarding Margaret full custody and significant alimony from Anthony's fortune. When Anthony's attorney, Bradley Ward, cross-examined Dr. Slaughter, she remained composed and confident. Her answers were rehearsed, her professional credentials impeccable. To an outside observer, she appeared to be a dedicated child psychologist protecting vulnerable children from an unstable father. But Anthony noticed what others missed: the slight facial tic when she lied, the way her eyes shifted toward Judge Haley when she wanted confirmation, the unconscious gesture of touching her left earring whenever she fabricated details. After 2 hours of testimony, Judge Haley called a recess. Anthony stepped outside the courtroom to find Jeremy waiting in the hallway, looking unusually nervous for a teenager. "Dad, I need to give you something," Jeremy said, glancing around to ensure they weren't being overheard. He handed Anthony a small envelope, the paper slightly crumpled for being concealed. "Don't worry, I handled everything." Anthony opened the envelope to find a micro SD card and a handwritten note, recording from under Dr. Slaughter's desk. "Mom and Carlos planning everything. Also phone records and photos. Jay." The revelation hit Anthony like lightning. Jeremy had been conducting his own investigation, using skills his father had never taught him, but that seemed to be genetic. During their session with Dr. Slaughter, Jeremy had somehow discovered and accessed Carlos's hidden recording device. How did you? Computer club at school teaches more than programming, Jeremy said with a slight smile. I've been watching Mom and Carlos for weeks. They're not as careful as they think. Anthony studied his son with new respect and growing concern. Jeremy had inherited not just his analytical mind, but also his willingness to take decisive action when threatened. The question was whether Anthony had created a protege or corrupted an innocent. Jeremy, what you've done is incredibly dangerous. If Carlos discovers, he won't. I was careful, and I made copies of everything before I returned his equipment. The courtroom doors opened, and Margaret emerged, her confident expression suggesting she believed victory was assured. She spotted Anthony and Jeremy talking and frowned, perhaps sensing that something had shifted. "Time to go back in," Bradley Ward said, appearing at Anthony's elbow. "Judge Haley is ready to render his decision." Anthony pocketed the envelope and followed his attorney back into the courtroom, acutely aware that he was about to deploy nuclear weapons in what should have been a custody proceeding. Judge Haley retook the bench, his hands visibly shaking as he prepared to read the predetermined ruling that Carlos had purchased with protection services and debt payments. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, Judge Haley began, "This court finds that the best interests of the children require." "Your Honor," Anthony interrupted, standing with military precision, "I respectfully request permission to present new evidence that directly contradicts Dr. Slaughter's testimony." The courtroom fell silent. Margaret shot a panicked glance toward the gallery where Dr. Slaughter sat, her face now pale with worry. "Mr. Huffman," Judge Haley said nervously, "all evidence was to be submitted prior to. This evidence only became available during today's proceedings, Your Honor. I believe the court has an obligation to consider information that directly bears on the welfare of my children." Anthony's tone carried the quiet authority of a man who'd commanded respect in war zones. Judge Haley, already drowning in corruption and debt, seemed to shrink behind the bench. "What type of evidence?" Anthony nodded to Bradley Ward, who produced a laptop and approached the bench. Audio recordings demonstrating that Dr. Slaughter's evaluation was not only fabricated, but was part of a criminal conspiracy to suborn perjury and obstruct justice. The words hit the courtroom like grenades. Margaret gripped her attorney's arm, while Dr. Slaughter began to rise from her seat as if to flee. "Your Honor," Phyllis Solis objected desperately, "this is highly irregular." "The irregularity," Anthony said coldly, "is allowing fabricated evidence to determine child custody. I suggest the court hear what Dr. Slaughter actually said when she thought no one was listening." Judge Haley's face had gone ashen. He understood that his own corruption was about to be exposed, that the carefully constructed conspiracy was unraveling in real time. "Play the recording," he whispered. Dr. Slaughter's voice filled the courtroom through the laptop speakers. "The psychological evaluation is next week. Carlos owes me a favor, something about evidence disappearing from a domestic violence case. She'll write whatever we need." The gasps from the gallery were audible. Margaret's face drained of color as her voice followed. "Paranoid personality disorder, potential for violence, history of controlling behavior." Enough to convince Judge Haley that the children aren't safe. The recording continued, documenting the entire conspiracy in devastating detail. Carlos's voice describing his arrangement with Judge Haley, Dr. Slaughter outlining how she'd manipulate the children's testimony, Margaret calculating how much of Anthony's fortune she could claim in the divorce. When the audio ended, the courtroom remained silent except for Dr. Slaughter's quiet sobbing. Margaret stared at Anthony with a mixture of fear and rage, finally understanding that she'd underestimated not just her husband, but also her son. Judge Haley sat frozen behind a bench, knowing that his career and freedom had just evaporated. The conspiracy that was supposed to destroy Anthony had instead documented their own criminal behavior in excruciating detail. "Your Honor," Anthony said quietly, "I move for dismissal of all custody restrictions and request that this matter be referred to the district attorney for criminal investigation." The judge's voice was barely audible. Motion granted. Court is adjourned. As the courtroom erupted in chaos, Anthony felt Jeremy slip beside him. "Dad, there's more," his son whispered. "Carlos is waiting outside. He has backup." Through the courthouse windows, Anthony could see Carlos Waters and 3 other police officers positioned around the building exits. They'd come prepared for victory, ready to arrest Anthony on fabricated charges if the custody hearing hadn't gone as planned. Margaret and her allies had underestimated more than Anthony's skills. They'd underestimated his willingness to wage total war against anyone who threatened his children. The real battle was just beginning. Chapter 5. The Hunter Becomes the Hunted. Anthony exited the courthouse through a side entrance that Jeremy had scouted earlier, avoiding Carlos's surveillance net with the practiced ease of someone who'd once evaded Taliban fighters in mountain caves. The corrupt sergeant had positioned his men at the main exits, expecting Anthony to emerge confused and defeated from what should have been his legal destruction. Instead, Anthony disappeared into downtown Seattle traffic while Carlos was still waiting for a victory that would never come. 20 minutes later, Anthony sat in Franklin Gilmore's office, watching multiple security monitors that tracked Carlos's increasingly frantic movements around the courthouse. The sergeant had finally realized his prey had escaped, and his growing desperation was evident in every gesture. "He's panicking," Franklin observed, highlighting Carlos's location on a digital map. "Making calls, trying to coordinate with the other dirty cops in his network." "Good," Anthony replied coldly. "Panicked men make mistakes." Spencer Stewart entered the office carrying a tactical bag that Anthony recognized from their Afghanistan days. Behind him followed Doug Bowers and Morris Carpenter, their faces carrying the same grim determination that had once made them an unstoppable unit. "Sit rep?" Spencer asked, using the military shorthand that came naturally after years of combat operations. Anthony briefed them on the courtroom revelation and Carlos's current position. "The immediate threat is to Jeremy and Laura. Carlos knows his entire conspiracy is exposed, which makes him extremely dangerous." "What's the extraction plan?" Doug asked, already analyzing traffic patterns on his tablet. "Jeremy and Laura are at Bellevue High School until 3 p.m. Margaret will try to collect them early, probably with Carlos providing enforcement. We need to get there first." Morris unzipped his medical bag to reveal equipment that had nothing to do with treating patients. "What about the judge and the doctor?" "They're secondary targets. Right now, Carlos is the primary threat because he has a badge and a gun, and he knows his career is over." Anthony's phone buzzed with a text from Jeremy. "Mom here early. Says family emergency. Won't go with her. Need help." The trap was closing faster than anticipated. Margaret had moved to secure the children while Carlos dealt with the courthouse fallout, but Jeremy's resistance was buying crucial time. "We go now," Anthony decided. "Spencer, you and Morris create a distraction at the courthouse. Make Carlos think I'm still in the area. Doug, you're with me." The drive to Bellevue High School took 18 minutes through afternoon traffic that seemed determined to slow their progress. Anthony's mind raced through contingencies while Doug monitored police communications on a scanner. "Carlos has put out a bolo for your vehicle," Doug reported. "He's claiming you threatened him in the courthouse." "Predictable," Anthony said, turning into the school parking lot. "He's trying to create legal justification for whatever he's planning to do next." They found Jeremy and Laura waiting in the principal's office, the administrator looking uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in her school. Margaret stood beside the desk with barely controlled fury, while Carlos waited in the hallway like a predator preparing to strike. "Mr. Huffman," the principal said nervously, "your wife says there's been a family emergency and she needs to take the children immediately." "There's no emergency," Anthony replied calmly, studying Carlos through the office windows. "My wife is attempting to violate a custody arrangement during an ongoing legal proceeding." Margaret's composure finally cracked. "Anthony, you don't understand what you're dealing with. Carlos has connections, resources." "I understand perfectly," Anthony interrupted, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made even the principal step back. Your boyfriend is a corrupt police officer who fabricated evidence to steal my children. The only emergency here is the one he's created for himself. Carlos chose that moment to enter the office, his hand resting conspicuously on his service weapon. Mr. Huffman, I need you to come with me for questioning regarding threats made in federal court. The lie was smoothly delivered, but Anthony noted the perspiration on Carlos's forehead and the slight tremor in his voice. The sergeant was improvising badly, trying to salvage a situation that had spiraled completely out of control. I'll need to see a warrant, Doug said, stepping forward with credentials that identified him as a federal investigator. This appears to be a local family matter outside your jurisdiction. Carlos's eyes narrowed as he processed this unexpected complication. He'd expected to intimidate a businessman, not confront someone who obviously shared Anthony's professional background. Children, Anthony said quietly, go wait with Mr. Bowers in the hallway. Jeremy and Laura obeyed immediately, sensing the dangerous undercurrents flowing between the adults. As they left, Anthony noticed Jeremy palming something from the principal's desk, probably another recording device, though Anthony couldn't be sure. Margaret, Anthony continued once the children were gone, you have one chance to walk away from this. Take it. I'm not going anywhere, she replied, though her voice lacked conviction. Carlos, arrest him. On what charges? Doug interjected. Exposing your criminal conspiracy? Carlos's hand moved closer to his weapon, and Anthony recognized the moment when words would give way to violence. In Afghanistan, he learned to read the precise instant when diplomacy failed and survival required different skills. Sergeant Waters, Anthony said softly, you should know that everything you've said and done in this room has been recorded and transmitted to federal authorities. Your conspiracy with Judge Haley and Dr. Slaughter is already under investigation. It was a bluff, but delivered with such confidence that Carlos hesitated. In that moment of uncertainty, Anthony struck. The movement was too fast for civilian eyes to follow. One moment Carlos was reaching for his gun. The next he was on the floor with Anthony's knee on his chest and his weapon secured in Doug's hands. Principal Williams, Anthony said calmly, as if subduing armed police officers was routine, I suggest you call 911 and report an attempted kidnapping by a suspended police officer. Suspended? Margaret gasped. As of 1 hour ago, Doug confirmed, checking his phone. Internal affairs moved faster than expected once they heard the recordings. Carlos struggled beneath Anthony's weight, his face red with exertion and humiliation. You have no idea what you've started. I have friends, connections. Anthony corrected. Your friends are currently being arrested by the FBI task force that's been investigating police corruption in King County. Your connections are being severed one by one. The principal had already called 911, her voice shaking as she reported the situation. Margaret stood frozen, finally understanding that her carefully planned coup had become a catastrophic defeat. Anthony, she whispered, we can work this out. The children need both parents. The children need protection from their mother, Anthony replied, standing as legitimate police officers entered the building. You chose Carlos over your family, Margaret. Live with the consequences. As Carlos was led away in handcuffs, Margaret made one final desperate attempt to assert her maternal rights. But the arriving officers had already been briefed on the situation by Doug's federal contacts, and Margaret found herself facing questions about her role in the conspiracy rather than being treated as a concerned mother. Jeremy and Laura watched the proceedings with wide eyes, finally understanding the full scope of their mother's betrayal. Anthony knelt beside them, his expression gentle despite the violence they'd witnessed. Are you both okay? Laura nodded silently, while Jeremy met his father's gaze with newfound respect. What happens now? Now we go home, Anthony said simply, and we start rebuilding our family. But as they left the school, Anthony knew the war was far from over. Margaret and Carlos had been defeated, but corruption networks didn't collapse overnight. There would be other battles, other enemies who needed to learn the price of threatening Anthony Huffman's children. He'd promised Jeremy that good people sometimes had to make hard choices. The hardest choice was still ahead. Chapter 6. The network unravels. The federal task force moved with surgical precision through Seattle's law enforcement community, guided by the evidence Jeremy had unknowingly provided and the intelligence Franklin's team had gathered. Within 72 hours of Carlos's arrest, 12 police officers, 4 judges, and 6 attorneys found themselves facing federal corruption charges. Anthony watched the news coverage from his study, noting how quickly the conspiracy network collapsed once exposed to daylight. Dr. Nina Slaughter had already pleaded guilty to fabricating psychological evaluations, desperately hoping to avoid prison time by cooperating with investigators. Judge Glenn Haley was found dead in his chambers, apparently from a heart attack brought on by the stress of facing federal prosecution and the violent collectors who held his gambling debts. Anthony felt no satisfaction in a man's death, merely the cold recognition that weak men faced predictable ends when their corruption was exposed. Margaret had been released on bail, but faced serious charges related to conspiracy and child endangerment. The society wife who'd once graced Seattle charity galas was now radioactive, shunned by former friends who feared association with the scandal. Franklin entered the study carrying a thick file. Final report on the cleanup operation. Anthony accepted the documents, noting that Franklin's team had been characteristically thorough. Every participant in the conspiracy had been identified, their crimes documented, their assets frozen pending trial. What about the children? Franklin asked. Jeremy understands more than I'd like, Anthony admitted. Laura knows her mother made bad choices, but she doesn't grasp the full scope of the betrayal yet. And Margaret? Anthony's expression hardened. Margaret ceased being my concern the moment she chose Carlos over our family. Her legal problems are her own to solve. That evening, Anthony found Jeremy in his room, apparently studying for a calculus exam, but actually monitoring encrypted communications on his laptop. The 16-year-old had developed concerning skills over the past weeks, demonstrating a natural aptitude for surveillance and intelligence gathering that reminded Anthony of his younger self. What are you working on? Jeremy closed the laptop with practiced nonchalance. Just homework. Jeremy, we need to talk about boundaries. Like the ones Mom and Carlos ignored when they tried to destroy our family. The bitter edge in his son's voice was troubling. Jeremy had been forced to grow up too quickly, exposed to adult betrayal and corruption that no teenager should witness. Your mother made terrible choices, but that doesn't mean you should abandon your moral compass. I didn't abandon anything, Jeremy replied. I protected our family using the tools available, just like you taught me. I never taught you surveillance techniques or electronic intelligence gathering. Jeremy's smile was cold beyond his years. You didn't have to. I've been watching you my whole life, Dad. I learned more from observation than most people learn from instruction. The revelation was both proud and terrifying. Anthony had tried to shield his children from the darker aspects of his nature, but Jeremy had absorbed those lessons anyway, applying them with a teenager's lack of moral restraint. Jeremy, I need you to promise me something. No more intelligence operations, no more surveillance, no more playing spy games. You're 16 years old. You should be worried about dates and college applications, not federal conspiracies. I'll think about it, Jeremy said, which wasn't the same as agreement. Anthony left his son's room with growing concern. In destroying Margaret and Carlos's conspiracy, he'd inadvertently created something potentially more dangerous. A protege who shared his skills but lacked the hard-earned wisdom that came from understanding the true cost of violence. Downstairs, Laura was curled up on the living room couch, reading one of her fantasy novels while trying to pretend everything was normal. At 14, she'd inherited her mother's artistic sensitivity, but also Anthony's stubborn strength. The combination made her resilient, but also vulnerable to the emotional trauma of watching her family disintegrate. How are you doing, sweetheart? I miss her, Laura admitted quietly. Even though I know what she did was wrong, she's still my mom. The simple honesty cut deeper than any of Margaret's betrayals. Laura was grieving the loss of the mother she'd thought she knew, struggling to reconcile the woman who'd read bedtime stories with the one who'd tried to steal her father's custody rights. It's okay to miss her, Anthony said, sitting beside his daughter. Love doesn't disappear, just because someone disappoints us. Do you still love her? The question hung in the air like a landmine. Anthony considered his answer carefully, knowing that Laura would remember his words for the rest of her life. I love the woman I thought I married, he said finally. But that person may never have existed. The woman I actually married chose to betray our family for money and a relationship with a criminal. That's not love, Laura. That's selfishness. Laura processed this with the serious consideration she brought to all important topics. What happens to us now? We rebuild, Anthony said simply. We learn to trust again, slowly and carefully. We create new traditions and make new memories. We prove that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice and commitment and protecting the people you love, even if it means doing bad things. The question revealed how much Laura had understood about recent events. Despite Anthony's efforts to shield her, she'd grasped that her father's methods hadn't always been legal or conventional. Sometimes, Anthony admitted, but only as a last resort, and only to protect innocent people from those who would hurt them. Like Mom and Carlos. Yes, Laura nodded solemnly, accepting truths that no 14-year-old should have to process. Will you teach me to protect myself? When you're older, if you still want to learn. I want to learn now, Laura said with quiet determination. I never want to be helpless again. Anthony studied his daughter's face, seeing not the dreamy artist she'd always been, but someone harder, more focused. Margaret's betrayal had changed them all, forcing innocence to give way to pragmatic understanding of how cruel the world could be. We'll start with self-defense classes, he decided. Basic awareness, personal safety, situational assessment. The other skills we'll discuss when you're 18. Promise? I promise. As Anthony tucked Laura into bed, he reflected on how completely Margaret's betrayal had transformed their family. She'd wanted to steal his children and his fortune, but instead she'd created something far more dangerous. A family bound together by shared trauma and united by absolute loyalty to each other. Jeremy had already demonstrated his willingness to wage war against anyone who threatened their unity. Laura was developing the same protective instincts, though tempered by her gentler nature. Anthony had tried to shield them from his darker capabilities, but circumstances had forced him to reveal the full scope of what he'd do to protect them. Margaret had gotten her divorce, but she'd also gotten something she never anticipated: enemies who would never forgive and never forget. The custody battle was over. Anthony had won decisively, claiming not just his children, but also their absolute devotion. Jeremy and Laura now understood that their father would literally kill to protect them, and that knowledge would shape every relationship they formed for the rest of their lives. Margaret had created monsters in her quest for money and freedom. Soon, she'd discover exactly what those monsters were capable of when truly threatened. Chapter 7. The Judgment Day. 6 months after the courthouse revelations, Anthony stood in his office overlooking Seattle's Elliott Bay, reading the final legal documents that would formally end his marriage to Margaret. The divorce proceedings had been remarkably swift once her criminal charges eliminated any possibility of alimony or shared custody. Margaret had been sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for conspiracy and fraud, though she'd been released pending appeal. Her lawyer, Phyllis Solis, had been disbarred and faced her own criminal charges for knowingly presenting fabricated evidence. Carlos Waters had received 8 years for corruption, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. His police pension had been revoked, his assets seized to pay restitution to his victims. He'd be middle-aged and unemployable when he finally emerged from federal prison. Dr. Nina Slaughter had received 5 years for her role in fabricating psychological evaluations, her medical license permanently revoked. The once respected child psychologist would never again have the opportunity to manipulate vulnerable families. Justice, Anthony reflected, had been served with mathematical precision. Franklin Gilmore knocked and entered, carrying an envelope marked with familiar encryption codes. Final intelligence report on the Margaret situation. Anthony accepted the documents, noting they were significantly thicker than expected. Complications? More like revelations, Franklin said grimly. We dug deeper into her background, following money trails and communication patterns. Anthony, she's been planning this for over 2 years. The file contained financial records showing Margaret had been systematically transferring money to hidden accounts, preparing for the divorce long before she'd announced her intentions. More disturbing were the communication logs showing she'd been in contact with Carlos Waters for nearly 3 years. There's more, Franklin continued. DNA analysis confirms Laura isn't your biological daughter, but the timeline suggests Margaret knew this from the beginning. She's been lying about paternity for 14 years. Anthony absorbed this information with the cold calculation he developed during years of processing battlefield intelligence. Margaret's betrayal hadn't been impulsive. It had been systematic, methodical, and utterly ruthless. Jeremy's definitely mine? Yes. But Anthony, there's something else. Margaret's been in contact with someone while awaiting sentencing. Someone with serious resources and a grudge against you. The final section of the file contains surveillance photos of Margaret meeting with a man Anthony recognized from his military days, Viktor Kozlov, a Russian arms dealer who'd lost substantial money when Anthony had disrupted his operations in Afghanistan. She's planning something, Franklin concluded. The question is what? Anthony studied the photographs, noting the expensive restaurant, the careful positioning to avoid security cameras, the way Kozlov's bodyguards maintained perimeter security. This wasn't a casual meeting between old acquaintances. Put the children under surveillance, Anthony decided. Full coverage, 24 hours. If Margaret wants to escalate this beyond divorce court, she'll discover I can escalate further than she imagines. That evening, Anthony gathered Jeremy and Laura in his study for a conversation he'd hoped to avoid. Both children had matured significantly over the past months, developing the careful awareness that came from understanding their family was under constant threat. We need to discuss your mother's recent activities, Anthony began, noting how Jeremy immediately tensed while Laura's expression became guarded. She's been contacting dangerous people, trying to find ways to hurt our family. I need you both to understand that the situation may become more serious than anything we've faced so far. How serious? Jeremy asked, his voice carrying the clinical detachment he'd developed when discussing threats. Potentially life-threatening. Laura gripped her father's hand. What do? We follow protocols, Anthony replied, using the military terminology that had become natural in their household. Enhanced security, modified routines, constant communication. And if something happens to me, you follow the emergency procedures we've practiced. Jeremy nodded understanding, but Laura looked stricken. Dad, you're scaring me. Good, Anthony said gently. Fear keeps you alive when people are trying to hurt you. Your mother has made choices that put us all in danger, and we need to be prepared for consequences. What kind of consequences? Jeremy pressed. Anthony considered how much truth his children could handle. Jeremy was already demonstrating capabilities that concerned him, while Laura was developing survival instincts that would serve her well, but at the cost of her innocence. Your mother is working with someone who blames me for destroying his criminal organization. He's the type of man who believes in collective punishment, hurting families to make political points. So we heard him first, Jeremy said with casual brutality that chilled Anthony. No, Anthony replied firmly. We protect ourselves and let law enforcement handle criminal threats. Jeremy's expression suggested disagreement, but he remained silent. Anthony made a mental note to monitor his son more carefully. The teenager was developing a taste for preemptive violence that needed to be controlled before it became uncontrollable. Dad, Laura said quietly, if something happens to you, what happens to us? Franklin will take care of you until you're adults. You'll have full access to my resources, complete protection, and the training necessary to defend yourselves. Training? Laura asked. The kind your mother's actions have made necessary. Anthony pulled out 2 encrypted phones, handing one to each child. Emergency protocols are programmed in. If anything seems wrong, anything at all, you use these immediately. That night, as Anthony reviewed security reports and contingency plans, he reflected on how completely his life had changed since Margaret's betrayal. He'd built a successful business, raised 2 children, and tried to leave his military skills behind. But Margaret's greed and vindictiveness had forced him to resurrect capabilities he'd hoped never to use again. She transformed their divorce from a legal proceeding into a war, and wars had consequences that extended far beyond the original battlefield. At 2:47 a.m., Anthony's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Package delivery scheduled for tomorrow. Return address, Moscow. The message came from one of Franklin's surveillance teams monitoring international communications. Viktor Kozlov was moving assets into Seattle, preparing for an operation that would target Anthony's family as payment for old debts. Margaret had gotten her divorce and her freedom. Now she discovered the price of allying herself with international criminals against the father of her children. Anthony dressed quietly and slipped out of the house, leaving behind the businessman who'd tried to build a peaceful life. By the time he returned, Viktor Kozlov would understand why disrupting Anthony Huffman's family had been a fatal mistake. The war Margaret had started was about to end, but not in the way she'd planned. Chapter 8: Blood and Betrayal. The abandoned warehouse in Georgetown had been used for drug distribution until Franklin's team cleared it with methods that ensured no police reports would be filed. Now it served as an interrogation facility where Viktor Kozlov's advance team was learning the price of threatening Anthony Huffman's children. Anthony entered the warehouse at dawn, carrying the tactical gear he'd hoped never to use again. Spencer Stewart and Morris Carpenter flanked him, their faces carrying the grim professionalism that had made them effective in Afghanistan's most dangerous operations. 3 of Kozlov's men hung from chains in the center of the warehouse, their faces bearing the methodical damage that Morris applied when extracting information. They'd arrived in Seattle expecting to kidnap Laura and Jeremy as leverage against their father, but instead had walked into a trap that Franklin's surveillance network had prepared. "What have they told you?" Anthony asked Morris, noting the professional precision of the interrogation. "Kozlov's personal involvement is revenge, but Margaret promised him access to your client files," Morris reported. "Apparently your security consulting business has information he wants about several government contracts." Anthony studied the captured men, recognizing the type of criminal who worked for international arms dealers. They were competent, but not exceptional, certainly not skilled enough to threaten his family without significant support. "Where's Kozlov?" "Safe house in Bellevue. 12-man security team, planning to grab the kids during school transport," Spencer reported. Margaret provided detailed intelligence on their routines, security protocols, everything. The scope of Margaret's betrayal continued to expand. She hadn't just allied herself with Kozlov for revenge. She'd sold detailed information about their children's vulnerabilities to international criminals. What about Margaret? Staying at the Fairmont Olympic penthouse suite, planning to leave the country once Kozlov has what he wants. Anthony absorbed this information with cold fury. Margaret had not only betrayed their marriage and their children, but had also committed treason by selling classified information to foreign criminals. The woman he'd once loved had become something that transcended mere enemy. She'd become a legitimate target. "Spencer, take your team and neutralize Kozlov's operation. Morris, coordinate with Franklin on cleanup. I'm handling Margaret personally." The drive to downtown Seattle gave Anthony time to plan his approach. Margaret would be expecting him, probably had security provided by Kozlov's organization. But she'd underestimated how thoroughly Anthony's military skills had been honed by years of hunting sophisticated enemies in hostile territory. The Fairmont Olympics penthouse suite occupied the top floor, accessible only by private elevator or emergency stairwell. Margaret had chosen the location for its security advantages, not realizing those same features would trap her when Anthony came calling. Anthony entered through the hotel's service areas, using maintenance corridors he'd mapped during his initial reconnaissance. The security team Margaret expected him to confront was positioned in the lobby and main elevators, leaving the service routes vulnerable to someone with his specialized training. He reached the penthouse level through ventilation shafts, emerging in a utility closet that connected to the suite's kitchen. The luxury apartment was quiet except for the sound of Margaret's voice drifting from the living room. Told you Anthony was dangerous, but you didn't listen, she was saying into her phone. He's already destroyed your advance team and probably knows exactly where you are. Anthony moved silently through the kitchen, noting the expensive furnishings Margaret had purchased with money stolen from their children's futures. She'd traded their family's security for luxury she'd never earned. No, I'm not overreacting, Margaret continued. You don't understand what he's capable of when. Anthony stepped into the living room, his Sig Sauer P226 trained on Margaret's chest. She dropped the phone, her face cycling through surprise, fear, and finally resignation. Hello, Margaret. Anthony. I wondered when you'd come. She was still beautiful at 38, still carried herself with the confidence that had attracted him 15 years ago. But her eyes held a calculation he'd never seen before, the cold assessment of someone who'd learned to view relationships as transactions. Where are Jeremy and Laura? Safe, Anthony replied. Unlike you. Margaret gestured toward the phone she dropped. Victor's probably dead by now, isn't he? Most likely. And his men, also dead. Margaret absorbed this information with surprising calm. I suppose I should have expected that. You always were thorough. You sold information about our children to international criminals, Anthony said quietly. Information that would have gotten them killed. I needed leverage, Margaret replied without apparent remorse. You destroyed my relationship with Carlos, my financial security, my social position. What was I supposed to do? Accept responsibility for your choices instead of escalating into treason. Margaret laughed bitterly. Responsibility? From a man who spent the last 6 months systematically destroying everyone who opposed him. I destroyed criminals who threatened my family. You became one of those criminals. I was desperate. You were greedy, Anthony corrected. Everything you've done has been motivated by money and revenge, not love for our children. Margaret's composure finally cracked. Those aren't even your children. Laura is Carlos's daughter, and Jeremy is a sociopath who learned everything from watching you. The accusation hung in the air between them. Anthony had known about Laura's paternity for months, but hearing Margaret weaponize that knowledge confirmed how completely she'd abandoned any maternal instincts. Jeremy is my son in every way that matters, Anthony said calmly. Laura is my daughter regardless of genetics. You're the one who chose criminals over children. I chose survival over servitude, Margaret snapped. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life as a supporting character in your success story. So you decided to steal our children and sell classified information to arms dealers. I decided to take what was rightfully mine. Anthony studied his ex-wife's face, searching for any trace of the woman he'd once loved. But Margaret Sweeney Huffman had been replaced by someone harder, more calculating, utterly without redemption. You could have had half of everything in a normal divorce, Anthony said. The children, financial security, a chance to rebuild your life. Instead, you chose war. I chose to win. You chose to lose everything. Margaret's expression shifted from defiance to something approaching fear. What are you going to do? Anthony considered the question with careful deliberation. Margaret had committed treason, endangered their children, and allied herself with international criminals. In Afghanistan, such actions would have merited immediate execution. But killing Margaret would traumatize Jeremy and Laura, potentially destroying the family he'd fought so hard to protect. Some prices were too high to pay, even for perfect justice. You're going to disappear, Anthony decided. Tonight. Permanently. You'll surrender all parental rights, transfer your remaining assets to the children's trust funds, and never contact our family again. And if I refuse? Anthony's expression conveyed the answer without words. Margaret had allied herself with killers, stolen classified information, and endangered innocent children. The legal system had already failed to provide adequate consequences for her actions. I won't refuse, Margaret said quietly, finally understanding that her ex-husband had moved far beyond legal remedies. Good choice. Anthony watched Margaret pack her few remaining possessions, noting how completely her life had been reduced to what could fit in a single suitcase. She'd gambled everything on destroying him and had lost spectacularly. As she prepared to leave, Margaret turned back one final time. Anthony, do you think Jeremy and Laura will ever forgive me? No, Anthony replied without hesitation. And neither will I. Margaret nodded sadly and walked toward the door, finally understanding that some betrayals created consequences that lasted forever. Anthony watched her disappear into the Seattle night, knowing he'd never see her again. Margaret Sweeney Huffman was dead, not physically, but in every way that mattered to the family she'd abandoned. His phone buzzed with a message from Spencer. Kozlov neutralized. All assets secured. No survivors. The war was over. Anthony had won decisively, claiming not just victory, but the complete destruction of everyone who'd threatened his children. Now he could return home to Jeremy and Laura, who were waiting for confirmation that their family was finally safe. Chapter 9. The New Dynasty. 1 year after Margaret's disappearance, Anthony stood in his renovated home office, reviewing architectural plans for the expansion that would accommodate the specialized training facilities Jeremy and Laura had requested. The children had grown into formidable young adults, shaped by trauma into something harder and more focused than their peers. Jeremy, now 17, managed the family security systems with professional competence while maintaining perfect grades at his elite private school. His college applications listed interest in international relations and computer science. But Anthony knew his son's true education had come from watching sophisticated criminal conspiracies unravel under methodical pressure. Laura, 15, had developed into an accomplished martial artist and surveillance expert while maintaining her cover as a talented artist bound for prestigious art schools. Her paintings had grown darker and more complex, reflecting an understanding of human nature that most adults never achieved. Franklin Gilmore entered the office carrying a thick portfolio marked with federal classification stamps. Final report on the Margaret situation, he announced. Anthony accepted the documents, noting they were significantly lighter than previous intelligence files. Resolution complete, Franklin confirmed. Margaret Sweeney was found dead in a Bangkok hotel room 3 months ago. Apparent suicide, though the Thai authorities weren't particularly thorough in their investigation. Anthony absorbed this information without visible emotion. Margaret had chosen her fate when she'd allied herself with international criminals, though he'd hoped she might find some form of redemption in exile. The children? Don't know yet. That's your decision. Anthony considered how much truth Jeremy and Laura could handle. They'd both matured significantly over the past year, but losing a parent, even one who betrayed them, carried psychological consequences that required careful management. I'll tell them tonight. In the future, Anthony gestured toward the architectural plans. We build something new, something stronger. That evening, Anthony gathered Jeremy and Laura in the renovated living room, noting how both children immediately assumed defensive positions despite being in their own home. The training they'd received had become instinctive, transforming them into young people who would never again be vulnerable to the kind of predators their mother had unleashed. We need to discuss your mother, Anthony began, watching their reactions carefully. Jeremy's expression remained neutral, but Laura's grip tightened on the throwing knife she'd been practicing with. Both children had learned to prepare for bad news. She's dead, Anthony said simply. Suicide in Bangkok, 3 months ago. Laura's reaction was immediate tears, not for the mother who betrayed them, but for the woman she'd once thought she knew. Jeremy remained silent, processing the information with the analytical detachment he'd developed. Are we safe now? Laura asked through her tears. Completely, Anthony confirmed. All threats have been neutralized, all enemies eliminated. You can live normal lives if you choose. Normal? Jeremy laughed bitterly. Dad, we haven't been normal since the custody hearing. We've been trained by former military specialists, educated in surveillance and counterintelligence, and taught to view relationships as potential security threats. The observation was accurate but troubling. Anthony had tried to prepare his children for survival in a dangerous world, but they'd absorbed lessons that would make forming healthy relationships extremely difficult. You can choose different paths, Anthony said carefully. College, careers, families of your own. The skills you've learned are tools, not destinies. What if we don't want different paths? Laura asked, her tears stopping with disconcerting suddenness. What if we want to use these skills to protect other families from people like Mom and Carlos? The question revealed how completely his children had been transformed by their experiences. Laura wasn't just asking about career options. She was requesting permission to become something dangerous. The family business could be expanded, Jeremy added. Security consulting, threat assessment, protection services for families facing custody battles with corrupt systems. Anthony studied his children's faces, seeing not the innocents he'd tried to protect, but the warriors they'd become. Margaret's betrayal had cost them their childhood, but had also given them purpose and skills that could serve legitimate ends. If that's what you choose, Anthony said finally, we'll do it together. But you understand the costs, the isolation, the constant vigilance, the inability to trust easily. We already live with those costs, Jeremy pointed out. At least this way, we use them productively. And we protect other kids from going through what we experienced, Laura added. Anthony felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. His children had survived their mother's betrayal and emerged stronger, but they'd paid a price that couldn't be calculated. They would never be normal teenagers, never experience the carefree relationships that most young people took for granted. But they would also never be victims. They would never be unprepared for betrayal, never be defenseless against predators, never be destroyed by someone else's greed or vindictiveness. Then we build something new, Anthony decided. Huffman Family Security, protection services for families under threat, specialized consulting for custody battles, intervention services for corruption cases. With extreme prejudice when necessary? Jeremy asked. Anthony considered the question carefully. His son was asking for permission to use lethal force in defense of innocent families, to become the kind of person who eliminated threats that legal systems couldn't address. When necessary, Anthony confirmed, but always as a last resort, and always with absolute certainty of guilt. Jeremy and Laura exchanged glances that conveyed volumes of silent communication. They'd reached an understanding that transcended normal family dynamics. They were becoming a military unit dedicated to protecting the innocent from the kind of predators they'd survived. What about Mom's memory? Laura asked softly. Anthony considered how to honor the woman Margaret had once been, while acknowledging the monster she'd become. His children deserved truth, but they also deserved peace. We remember the good parts and learn from the bad parts, he said finally. Your mother loved you in her own way, but she made choices that put her personal desires above her children's welfare. We use that knowledge to become better people and better protectors. No forgiveness? Jeremy pressed. No forgiveness, Anthony confirmed. Some betrayals are unforgivable, especially when they endanger children. But also no hatred. Hatred clouds judgment and compromises effectiveness. Laura nodded solemnly. Cold justice. Exactly. As the evening progressed, Anthony outlined his vision for their family's future. They would build a legitimate business that provided protection services while serving as cover for more aggressive interventions when legal remedies proved inadequate. Jeremy would handle technology and intelligence gathering, utilizing skills that had already proven devastatingly effective against criminal conspiracies. Laura would manage human intelligence and psychological assessment, her artistic sensitivity providing insight into human motivations that formal training couldn't teach. Anthony would coordinate operations and handle the most dangerous interventions, using military skills he'd hoped to leave behind, but which circumstances had forced him to resurrect. What do we call ourselves? Laura asked as they finalized their plans. Anthony looked at his children, no longer children, really, but young adults forged by trauma into something harder and more focused than their peers would ever become. We call ourselves family, he said simply. Everything else is just business. That night, as Anthony reviewed security protocols and operational plans, he reflected on how completely Margaret's betrayal had transformed their lives. She'd wanted to destroy him and steal his children, but instead she created something far more dangerous. A family bound together by shared trauma and united by absolute loyalty to protecting the innocent. Jeremy and Laura would never have normal lives, but they would have meaningful ones. They would use their hard-earned skills to protect other families from the kind of predators that had nearly destroyed their own. Margaret had gotten her divorce and her freedom, but she'd also created her own replacement, children who would spend their lives undoing the damage caused by people like her. The Huffman family had been broken and rebuilt into something stronger. They would never forgive, never forget, and never again allow betrayal to threaten innocent children. Margaret's legacy would be the very thing she tried to destroy. A family that understood the true cost of loyalty and the absolute necessity of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The war was over. The dynasty had begun. Epilogue. 5 years later, Huffman Family Security had become the most respected and feared protection service on the West Coast. Their success rate was perfect because they didn't just protect clients. They eliminated threats with methodical precision that left no loose ends. Jeremy had graduated from MIT with degrees in computer science and international relations, his senior thesis on cyber warfare earning classification by federal authorities. Laura had earned early admission to Stanford's art program while maintaining her cover as a sensitive artist rather than a lethal intelligence operative. Anthony watched his children work together on their latest case, a custody battle where a judge was being bribed to award custody to an abusive father. The corrupt official would soon discover that some families fought back with resources and skills that legal systems couldn't comprehend. Margaret's betrayal had cost them their innocence, but given them purpose. They would spend their lives ensuring that other families never experienced the trauma that had forged them into weapons. In the end, Margaret had gotten exactly what she'd wanted, a divorce that freed her from the constraints of family loyalty. But she'd also gotten something she never anticipated, children who would dedicate their lives to destroying people like her. Some lessons could only be learned through betrayal. Some strengths could only be forged through trauma. Some families could only be created through surviving attempts to destroy them. The Huffman family understood all of these truths with perfect clarity, and they would never forget. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen, and I'll see you there.